We begin to wind down Colossians, and as I mentioned earlier in the service, we'll be pivoting back to Ephesians when this is done. But as we wind down Colossians, we're focusing on being a faithful steward. And as you think about being a faithful steward, in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, it says, and you can read it, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards," managers, "of the mysteries of God." So a mystery of God is something that we would not have figured out by ourselves, but he chose to make it known. And that the ultimate mystery of God is Christ himself. God chose to speak, ultimately spoke in the person of his Son, and he shows us things about God. As Jesus himself said, "If you see me, you've seen the Father." And then through Christ and his apostles and down to this day, the church, the people of God, have been entrusted with this message, this word, this mystery. But then comes the last part. "Moreover, it is required of stewards," if you've been entrusted with this, "that they be found faithful." As we talked about over at the Grace Bible Church before we started the blended services, "I will build my church." What is this thing called church? "I will make disciples of all nations." That we need to be found faithful to the things that's been entrusted to us. As Jude says, one of the last New Testament books to be written, that we should be earnestly contending for the faith that's been delivered, handed over, entrusted to the saints. Well, if we're going to do that and we turn back to Colossians, then we want to, first of all, pray steadfastly. As Paul says, continue steadfastly in prayer. And he mentions a few different things there. But when he says steadfastly, the idea is cling tightly to, stay close to this. It doesn't mean you're outwardly praying all the time. But it means that when you pray without ceasing, when you stay tightly close to this, when you are thinking about what are you really wishing for? Because prayer is a lot more than wish, but it's not less than that. The word actually means to wish for something. Of course, it's directed to a God who has his own wishes, and it's part of how we align our wishes with him. But I like to push into that point, not stop there, because it's not just magical thinking. But this praying steadfastly doesn't mean you're walking around praying all the time. It means that you are developing a posture where earlier and earlier in your own processing of life, as it hits you in the face and things come up, you're directing it back to this idea of, why am I here? What is my purpose? Father, help me to discern that. How do I represent you well right now in this moment? How am I about building your church? How am I about making disciples? And so sometimes I'm praying that out loud, but I'm developing a continual attitude, a steadfast attitude of prayer, where that way of processing things is getting earlier into my stream. Because what most makes us get focused is when something feels threatening. That's not bad. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But am I praying in a way that I'm staying close to this, even when it's hard? This idea of steadfastly and staying close to it, Job's wife in Job chapter 2, after Job got hammered by Satan a couple times, was like, "Are you still clinging steadfastly to your faith?" And Job's short answer was, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Of course I am. I'm not going to accept what is pleasant to me from the Lord, but then reject what is not pleasant to me, what I label good or evil." Polycarp, probably taught directly by John, on his way to being martyred, said Christians ought to always be steadfast. So you're on your way to being killed for your faith in Christ. Polycarp clearly understood that if you read his letter. He wasn't expecting to get out of it. And he's saying, even in that scenario, I am clinging to, we should be pivoting more quickly to, this should be earlier in our processing, to cling steadfast to, doesn't say prayer, Polycarp says hope. But that's the idea of steadfast, is it's getting earlier in your processing, and then you fight to hang on to that. So that's praying steadfastly. So when we pray steadfastly, we need to be watchful. Okay? Watchful, right here in the passage. Being watchful in it, in this continual, your own processing of prayer, being prayerful, and how you're processing things. This watchful means focusing on threats. And we have to define threats well, because the cross was threatening to Jesus. He wasn't wrong, but it was essential to the mission. And what did he do when for the first time in his human life he didn't feel like doing the will of the Father? He prayed. He got it into his processing. He asked his closest friends to come with him. He brought 3 closer in, and then he went by himself. What I talk about in your processing is get your 10 or 11. Judas doesn't count. Right? Get your 2 or 3, but then you have to go even beyond that, and you have to fight it out with God. That way, even if your 3 fall asleep, even if your 11 fall asleep, you're still being watchful. You're still being prayerful. You are aware of the threats. And it's what Jesus talks about when he says, hey, a lot of the discipleship life means challenging your own motives and attitudes and being as innocent as a dove and as shrewd as a serpent. That is like so hard for us. Because when we're in watchfulness mode, shrewd as a serpent mode, assessing threats, it's very, very hard to like see the things, which is what the next thing he mentions, to be thankful for. So he moves on. Yes, be watchful, but in your watchfulness, do it with thanksgiving. Don't overly spiritualize it. Think about when you're assessing threats and worried about dangers and making sure that you're trying to keep your people safe and all that. Right at that moment's when you feel most thankful. No. Unless we intentionalize it. Unless we're doing even that with thanksgiving. Because it's part of our fallenness where 3 or 4 negatives will outweigh 10,000 positives. And I say this often in Exodus, where God tells the people, I'm a jealous God. He's passionate. He cares about you. He's involved. Visiting sins to the 3rd and 4th generation, we stop. We're like, wow, that's rough. But showing mercy and love for 1,000. We don't read the second part. We get the watchful part. We don't get the thankful part. And we have to do both. In our prayer, in our processing, as we are steadfast in this. And all of it's coming together. When you say being watchful and thankful, focusing on the blessings, optimistic, you want to stay, finally, missional. He says it right in the verse. So yeah, continue steadfastly in prayer. Be watchful with thanksgiving. And at the same time, while you're doing all that in your processing, here's what you should be praying toward. That God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ. Regardless of how it affects you personally. Because how did it affect Paul? On account of which I'm in prison. So he had dedicated his life to understanding the mission, understanding the threat, being thankful that he was even entrusted with it, praying for an open door for ministry, a relatively faithful person doing that. Paul's the first missionary. He's on mission, besides Jesus. He's the second missionary. And all to declare the mystery of Christ and point people to Jesus. And where did it land him? In prison. When he wrote this letter. But he's still praying, open a door for the word, declare the mystery of Christ. And he says, even though it's gotten him in prison, that I should make it clear. So that's part of a missional prayer, right? Open a door for the word, declare Christ, and that I am making it clear, as I should. That's how I ought to speak. When he talks about making it clear, he's saying, make it tangible. Make it observable. Make it clearly seen. So if there's someone outside the faith, which he's about to pivot to, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, that there's just something about you that's different. It might even look kind of foolish and crazy to them, because Paul says it often looks that way, the ways of God. But there's just something different about you. You love your enemies. You don't keep score. which means we try to love our enemies and we try to let it go. But the Christian is pivoting that way more quickly than the world does. And we should be living in a way that those outside the faith who don't see Jesus, they don't know Jesus, but they do see you. How you live, how you speak, what really motivates you. That if this whole thing of the mission and the word is earlier in your processing, any unbeliever who knows you for any length of time should figure out pretty quickly you're a Christian. Because this is so far up in front of how you live life. That doesn't mean you're beating them over the head with the gospel all the time. We'll talk about that later when we talk about your conversation is always of grace seasoned with salt. I'll get to that in a minute. It's in the passage. Right. But how you live and how you speak should make Jesus more and more clear to people, not less clear. So, are you living in a way that opens the door for the word, declaring the mystery of Christ? Are you being thankful and watchful and holding yourself accountable? Am I doing that? Right? All of that, as we're praying steadfastly for all of these things, means we live wisely. And that's where he pivots in verse 5. Walk in wisdom, but especially toward outsiders. He says, making the best use of time. Now, look, in my life, when I was young and I first went in ministry, I made it all the way through seminary, married, young kids, working a job, going through seminary. But my wife, who was better at this than me, was like, you really should use a day planner. I had I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't feel like But eventually, I started realizing I'm dropping the ball. I was getting busier and busier. And she had this great system she used back then. It was well known. I won't get into that right now. So she's trying to get me to use this different day planner. None of them worked for me. I eventually created my own. My wife looked at it and said, I can't make sense of that. That stresses me out to see it. But it works for me. I think I showed Debbie Harton my to-do list once. Right? She was like, okay. But it works for me. It took me a while to develop it. So that and here's how it actually, making the best use of time. That's what we're talking about right here, right? But what it really did for me, even if there's 70-some things on it for 1 week, is allow me not to stress all the time. Because once I got it into that, I knew I could just be faithful and grind away. And I could learn to put people first, so when someone walks in, you can pivot away from that and try to focus on the person, because that's more important. And that's hugely important in Christian life, to do that well, because that's part of being a faithful steward. But that's not what this verse is talking about. When it says make the best use of time. He's not talking about everybody gets 168 hours a week. Everybody gets 24 hours in a day. You can't create more. You don't get less. So manage it well. That's important. But you actually do all that well, like my to-do list. Because, remember, he's saying walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of time. The idea of time here is not chronology. It's not the tick, 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 which some of you are already like, is he done yet? Watching the clock. It's not that. It's actually, you need to be managing all these things well, and prayer needs to be further up in your processing. Not just praying about all the things that you're worried are bad that might happen to you, but praying missionally. So that you even notice the opportunities, not just the obstacles. That you notice the mission, not just the threats. There are threats. That you are seizing these opportunities. And Paul says basically the same thing in Ephesians when we pivot back to it. When he says, make the most of every opportunity, for the age is evil. Here's the big point when you look at those two statements in Ephesians and Colossians. Do you actually think this world, our just human nature, the way it is, left to itself, is actually going to just give you an opportunity to advance the work of the kingdom? It's not going to do it. It's an evil age. It's resistant to the work of the kingdom. So if you don't seize these opportunities, then they'll just go. You may not even notice them. They're just gone. And we like to think, because we teach God's grace, as we should, and salvation is by grace through faith, that no bad thing could ever be permanent. He'll just keep giving you more opportunities to do a good thing. And the way I point that out to people is, so we got back into Eden, right? No. Look, God is good. And if we blow an opportunity badly enough that it's gone forever, it doesn't stop him. He'll build a new one. But opportunities can be lost forever. And we don't like that. We don't want to own that part of our stewardship. But it's in Colossians and Ephesians. You'll hear me say it again when we get to Ephesians, if I'm preaching that week. Might be Matthew. Might be someone else. But that sense of making the best use of time, just to really drive that point home, is not about managing your to-do list well. You manage that well, so when that person walks in, you're not so stressed trying to hold so many things in your head that you don't notice that they're troubled. And just pivot from that and be present and say, this is an opportunity to represent a God who cares. You won't even notice it. And guess what will make you less likely to notice it? If you're not managing your to-do list well. So you're just stressed, overwhelmed, thinking about all the bad things that might happen. If you forget this, forget that, and then you're not even seeing this. We all do it. We all get distracted that way by our own tasks, which is, again, a huge part of stewardship. And then we don't even see the opportunity God's putting right in front of us. And you have to seize them. You have to, in a sense, make that happen. You're not making the opportunity happen. You're making yourself see and seize the opportunity that God's already made happen. To do that, as we go to seize opportunities, we have to speak well. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. I said I was going to come back around to this because I really want to unpack that for a minute. Not literally 1 minute. Don't hold me to that. Some of you do. But, all right. When we talk about seizing opportunities and speaking well, that's let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. The whole idea of speech in Scripture, your communications. Yes, verbal, but nonverbal is part of it too. Jesus, as the word of the Father, says he spoke just what the Father wanted him to say, which is the focus here, the content, but also just how he wanted him to say it, emotionally, his vibe, his tone. It all came together. This one is focusing on the content. But when he says gracious, that's the part, okay, well, God's a God of grace. We need to be gracious. But this phrase, gracious but seasoned with salt, it is a common phrase in the world of that day. Now, Paul is bringing, when he talks about grace, he's bringing an understanding of grace in the gospel of Jesus Christ that takes this common saying much further than the way people of the world understood it. But it includes that understanding and transcends it. We shouldn't just read this verse and then go back and reverse engineer and make all of these other passages in human literature fit it. We sometimes do that theologically. We'll say God is agape love, but then we'll come up with some concept of agape love that doesn't seem very loving at all. When God's like, hey, you have this concept in your mind that you guys think in Greek. I'm like that. Okay, so when you get this phrase, gracious but seasoned with salt, that's a common phrase that Paul's now using in the context of your mission as a Christian. So we'll talk about that gracious part first. But if there's no salt, it's just like this bland feel-goodism. Liberal Protestant theology. Just come to church, feel good. As long as everybody feels good, we're fine. No mission, no calling out of good and evil. I just want you to feel better. It's a group therapy session, which has its place. That's not all church is. But the season with salt, some of us, look, we should be seasoning life with salt. But some of us Christians are just downright salty. And we'll justify it by saying, hey, someone needs to speak the truth. But if you ever try to, if you tried to digest something that's like super salty, first bite, what do? Okay. What happened? Okay, if you're like dying of thirst and then you see salt water, so you drink it, what happens to you? It shuts down your kidneys. It overwhelms your system. Some of us are so salty, we overwhelm people. And then when they reject us, we say, I'm persecuted for Christ. No, you're persecuted because you're being a jerk, okay? It's not the same thing. That's not what this means. Now, granted, when Christ himself, he is the Word, he's always the perfect, gracious, seasoned with salt. Okay? And there were people who had no ears to hear it, and they reacted like he was the problem. Okay, you're not going to get away from that totally. Many do not have ears to hear Jesus' message. Some of us it doesn't seem like you have ears to hear, but I'm going to make you. And Jesus had the wisdom, no, don't do that. You can't make them. That's something between their soul and God that we're never going to fully understand. We can see, well, you have faith. You know, that seems personal to you and real. It's changing your life. Those are signs. But it's not sometimes that they don't have ears to hear the message. It's they don't have ears to hear my saltiness or your saltiness. What the phrase is really getting at is this challenges Christians to actively engage with the outside world, that you should be setting up your life, whatever you're doing, even this thing called church, in a way that allows you to connect more fully with the outside world, as Jesus prayed, in the world, but not of it. So we should be trying to position everything where unbelievers are seeing it more often. Now, Sunday morning is primarily for believers and people that have God's done enough of work in them where they've walked in the doors. Because we do need that time to gather together and worship. And you can't cater the whole Sunday morning message just to the person who's never heard before, because everybody needs to grow. Okay? But we should be thinking about everything we're doing in a way that when it comes to, we are engaging with outsiders in a gracious, seasoned way. And remember, this was a common phrase in that world. So you can dig into some contemporary literature. I don't want to get lost in all those technical details. I want to drive home the main point. And the image is clear. Salt seasons in this way. It makes it more interesting to what to other people might otherwise be bland. And it might be bland because they're just like me. They have no concept of taste. They're just barbarians. But that doesn't excuse you from you are actually trying to draw them in and be interesting. One ancient writer contrasted speech seasoned with salt with the speech of the academics, which he called unsalted and insipid, lacking flavor. That helps you get an idea of what he's talking about here. Keep it real. Another speaks of the pastime of everything that goes on as you interact with people when you are just engaging in a pastime, watching a baseball game or the Masters or whatever, or you're in a business endeavor. That it all needs to be seasoned with the salt of conversation and wit. Hey, laugh or cry. Get people to laugh a little bit. He called wit the tastiest condiment of all. And this writer said that wit is actually called by some people graciousness. Because if you're in a really, really stressful situation, I know Wayne loves first responders, I love first responders, you talk with them a lot or whatever, you can be in the most horrific thing. Sometimes it's not even a first responder. When I was doing concrete work, or you're just doing something really, really physically nasty, dirty, hard, stinky, and and you just say something funny. You just make light of it. You keep it light. And everybody laughs. And there's a connection that happens. And everybody gets back on mission. They work better. They work more aligned. But then there's the people who are like, it's not funny. Okay, look, I sometimes joke in inappropriate ways, which aren't funny. But the attempt is to season with salt. One scholar today said, the picture is as far as we can imagine from that of a Christian who has no interest in affairs outside of the faith and has no ability to just like connect with people and talk with people, no ability to maintain an interesting conversation, no ability to talk about anything that is what most people are talking about and use all that to build bridges. Rather, what Paul is saying here and what this scholar talks about, looking at some of these other contemporary references, ancient references that I just mentioned to you, what he's talking about here is you are posturing yourself in a way and you're carrying yourself in a way and you're conversing with people in a way that leverages opportunities. What did he just say? Seize the opportunity. It's not going to be given to you. It's like Jesus with the Samaritan woman sitting at a well. Can I have a drink? It's the most common conversation that brilliantly touched on all this cultural estrangement, even enmity and hatred, built a bridge to a spiritual conversation. That's a conversation of grace seasoned with salt, where Jesus is actually appealing to the Samaritan woman's noblest intentions to just help someone who needs a drink. And he did it for the Samaritan woman's sake. So Christians should be able to engage with non-Christians in lively conversation and topics. You know who we engage with? We engage with other Christians about secondary or even third, tertiary doctrines, all these things that we want to debate about forever, and it's a lively conversation, and it's doing nothing to advance the ball. And we love to do that, but we're not good at just like engaging with outsiders, seizing the opportunity in a way that's gracious and seasoned. This one scholar that I just mentioned says, such advice pictures a group of Christians in a sufficiently positive, optimistic relationship with the surrounding community for such conversations to be natural. They're not a group that's fearful or threatened. They're not so separate that they can't even really engage. But they're building their whole life in a way that puts them in the community, that they're open to and in a positive relationship with their neighbors. Isn't that the incarnation? Like the Word of the Father put himself in our community, left his comfort, and put himself in our community. In short, if we're going to speak well in a gracious and a seasoned way, then we are just responding like Jesus. He is the example. He ends this section with saying, okay, seize the opportunity, make the best use of time, be gracious but seasoned, so you may know how you ought to answer every person, how you ought to respond to every person in a discerning way. How you ought to answer, this idea of, I am discerning, I'm recognizing the opportunity to advance the ball. This person might not have ears to hear it, in which case I don't try to beat them over the head, make a couple attempts if I sense they don't have ears to hear. As Peter said, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you to those who ask. And the idea there is they're open. It's a sincere question. They're curious. But this idea of how you ought to answer is a very discerning term. And not just answer, oh, look, I figured out my apologetic, so now I have my one response. Oh, you don't understand the Trinity. Blam! It's like, okay, you don't understand the Trinity. Well, okay, I've studied the Trinity a lot, but wait, what's your concern? Like, you have to tailor it. You have to be in the moment and really try to answer each person. There'll never be a formula for that. You have to be in the moment. You have to be prayerful. Your prayer needs to be missional, thankful, discerning. You need to be thinking about how can I seize an opportunity. You need to be gracious and seasoned. And if you're doing all of that, then you have a chance to know how you ought to answer each person. And look, I'm in a lot of those kinds of conversations. And then the conversation ends and they go their way. And the first thing you start doing is saying, why did I say that? That was stupid. I should have said this. Why didn't I say that? And then you mention it to someone else, and what's their first response? Well, why didn't you say this? We all do that. It's not actually very helpful typically, but we all do it. It doesn't really help us have confidence for the next conversation. And we're not going to be like Jesus, who just, of course, is hitting it out of the park every time, regardless of the response of the hearers. Most of them didn't hear him, and it wasn't because he didn't say it right. It's just, that's the mission, that we would respond to this whole thing called life like Jesus does, so we would know how we ought to answer every person. And when we do that, we are showing people what church ought to be. And next week, we'll wind down Colossians and then move into Ephesians. But I do want to touch on just a couple examples of this list of people that Paul mentions at the end of the letter. So Paul mentions Tychicus. He says, he'll tell you all about my activities, which would probably take hours because Paul just was always a grinder. He just kept grinding. All Paul's activities related to everything he's trying to do to advance the ball of the mission. Very, very hard worker, very tough individual. I said Paul was the first missionary besides Jesus. Eventually, all of the apostles left their culture, their homeland, some of them because they were driven out, and went out of their comfort zone and into the world. But Paul, with Barnabas, was the first to do that and go to the nations, the Gentiles. And so Tychicus will tell all about my activities. Look, don't kill yourself, but we should be busy. We should make sure that we're busy about the things that are really the most important. One of which is, I need to be busy to make sure I have appropriate rest. And that's important too. The whole work-rest rhythm. And we need to feel like, hey, I'm living on mission enough that what I'm doing is meaningful and important. And when I'm not doing it, I can rest and realize that God's ultimately building his church. But then he mentions, just mentioned Tychicus and Onesimus, and he talks about both of them as being beloved and faithful. So just be a very loving person, and that means as you interact with other people, it's not just like getting to know them. That's important. Listen, try to get to know them, see where they're coming from. It's also about letting yourself be known. That's actually scarier. But when we open up and we're raw with people appropriately, look, anytime someone's done that for us, isn't that like, oh, wait, you struggle with that too? Oh, okay. Like I'm not this irredeemably bad person. Well, I might be, but you're not. No. When we just open up with people, we're so scared and we're so self-critical and it's so devilish in the accusation that we don't realize that it helps other people when you let yourself be known. And when you really try to that's beloved. There's that deep connection. And faithful. So they're on mission, they're steadfast, they're grinding, they're keeping the right priorities, they're positioning themselves well to outsiders. Both of them are called faithful and beloved, Tychicus and Onesimus. And all of that, the last thing I wanted to mention was, verse 8, Paul had sent Tychicus to them for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, because we love each other, and that he may encourage your hearts. The number one thing over time that wrecks the mission, look, there's the crazy flameouts from church leaders that, of course, the media grabs and publicizes, and those are very, very discouraging. It's not really why most people fall away. That's the excuse they use to fall away. Most people fall away simply because they just get discouraged. And they just kind of get, the fancy term is this old term called acedia, which means they just kind of get slothful and numb and not really like focused on how important this thing called church is. And they kind of just retreat to a smaller and smaller circle when it comes to the things of the kingdom. They're not really connecting with outsiders. Maybe sometimes there can be ego in there. I'd rather be a big fish in a small pond. That could be, who knows what's going on in the hearts. But all of it is forms of, I lose courage to just stay on the mission. The opposite of courage is not fear. Fear is what makes courage possible. Fear is just an opportunity and an energy that you will process well or poorly. What is the opposite of courage is not fear, it's discourage. So when we get discouraged, when we just kind of check out, when we just, whatever. That's what Paul's like, no, don't let that happen. That kind of just numbness and lack of engagement and distraction and maybe doom scrolling or redirecting all of our hope to this world to politics or something like that, which are important. We should be able to talk about them, but they're not the mission compared to the work of just pointing people to Jesus. All those things are where we just like, whatever. And we get discouraged. And Paul's like, don't let that happen. Don't let that happen. I'm sending tickets to you to encourage your heart. The mission is worth it. Show people what church ought to be. When you do all of that, you pull it all together, then you're being a faithful steward. That's why we're here. I close with 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2 again. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of a steward that he be found faithful. Let's pray, and then we'll close with the closing song. Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you for this worship service. I thank you for church, for the opportunity to gather. Help us to walk out of here prayerful and living on mission, steadfast, showing people what church ought to be and making the most of opportunities. Let our conversations be gracious and seasoned with salt. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.